The neon lights above the pool table have been flickering for months now, casting these strange green and red shadows that dance across the worn felt like some kind of fever dream. I remember thinking about that the exact moment everything changed between us. How the light made Damian's face look different, sharper somehow, like I was seeing him through a filter I hadn't noticed before. I was lining up what should have been an easy shot. The 8-ball sat there waiting, practically begging to be sunk into the corner pocket. I made this shot 100 times before, maybe 1,000. My grip on the cue was steady, my breathing even. This was muscle memory, the kind of confidence that comes from spending too many evenings in the student union pool hall instead of studying like I should have been. But then Damian moved closer. Not unusual in itself. We'd been playing together for months, and he had this habit of hovering, offering commentary that was rarely helpful and usually distracting. What was unusual was how close he got this time. Close enough that I could smell his cologne, that cheap stuff he bought at the drugstore but somehow made work. Close enough that when he leaned down, ostensibly to get a better look at my angle, his breath touched the side of my neck. Winner gets me. The words were so quiet, I almost convinced myself I'd imagined them. Almost. But there was something in the way he said it, something deliberate and weighted that cut through all the ambient noise of the bar. The jukebox was playing some classic rock song I couldn't name, and there were voices from the other tables, the crack of balls breaking, the clink of beer bottles. All of it faded into background static the moment those 3 words hit the air between us. I froze with the cue still poised above the ball, my body caught between the shot I was about to take and the sudden understanding that this game had become something entirely different. My heart started doing this erratic thing in my chest, like it couldn't decide whether to speed up or stop altogether. I could feel Damian still standing there beside me, not moving away, not clarifying or laughing it off like it was just another one of his jokes. I'd known Damian for 8 months. We met in a general education psychology class neither of us wanted to take, ended up as partners for some group project about behavioral conditioning. I remembered being annoyed at first because he seemed like the type who would let others do all the work while he charmed his way to a decent grade. I was wrong about that, as it turned out. Damian was smart in ways that surprised me, thoughtful when he thought no one was looking. Our friendship had developed the way most college friendships do. Gradually, through shared complaints about professors and late-night food runs, and the kind of easy companionship that fills the spaces between classes and responsibilities. We started playing pool because the tables in the student union were free and neither of us had money to spend at the actual bars downtown. What began as a way to kill time between classes evolved into this routine, this anchor point in weeks that otherwise felt chaotic and uncertain. I told myself it was just friendship. When Damian would brush his hand against mine, reaching for the chalk, when he'd stand a little too close while I was setting up a shot, when his laugh would linger in the air after everyone else had moved on to other conversations. I explained it all away as the natural ease of someone comfortable in his own skin, someone who didn't overthink every interaction the way I did. But now, standing there with the 8-ball waiting and Damian's challenge hanging in the space between us, I couldn't pretend anymore that what I felt was just friendship. The attraction I'd been carefully not acknowledging for months suddenly felt as obvious as the neon light buzzing overhead. I lifted my head slightly, not enough to look at him directly, but enough to catch him in my peripheral vision. He was watching me with this expression I'd never seen before. Not the easy grin he wore when he was being charming, not the focused intensity he got when he was actually trying to win. This was something else entirely. Something that made my mouth go dry and my grip tighten on the cue. The smart thing would have been to straighten up, to laugh and ask him what he meant, to diffuse whatever tension was building between us with humor or confusion or outright denial. The smart thing would have been to recognize that this was dangerous territory for 2 friends who had to see each other in class every Tuesday and Thursday, who had built something good and uncomplicated that I was about to complicate beyond repair. Instead, I took the shot. The cue ball connected with a satisfying crack, sending the 8-ball rolling across the felt in a perfect straight line toward the corner pocket. I watched it drop, heard the decisive thunk as it hit the bottom of the table, and felt absolutely no satisfaction for making what should have been a triumphant winning shot. Because I knew Even before I straightened up and turned to face him, that winning this game was actually the most dangerous thing I could have done. Winning meant I had to collect my prize. Winning meant I had to decide what Damian's words actually meant and what I was going to do about it. The bar continued its familiar rhythm around us. Someone fed more quarters into the jukebox, and a new song started up, something slower this time. The group at the table next to ours burst into laughter over some joke I hadn't heard. Life carried on as normal while I stood there holding my pool cue like an anchor, trying to figure out how to navigate waters I'd never been in before. Damian was still watching me, still wearing that expression that made him look like a stranger wearing a familiar face. He wasn't smiling, but he wasn't backing down either. There was a patience in his stillness, like he was willing to wait for me to catch up to whatever realization he'd already reached. I opened my mouth to say something, though I had no idea what words might come out. Before I could speak, he stepped even closer, close enough that anyone watching would assume we were having an intimate conversation about our next game or making plans for the rest of the evening. Close enough that when he spoke again, his voice was meant for my ears alone. "So what do you want to do with me?" I never answered his question that night. Not directly, anyway. Instead, I did what I always did when things got too intense, too real. I deflected. I suggested we get another beer, made some comment about how the table next to us was getting rowdy, anything to buy myself time to think. Damian let me have that escape route, but not without giving me this look that said he knew exactly what I was doing. That was 3 weeks ago, and I've been replaying that moment ever since. The way his voice sounded when he asked what I wanted to do with him. The way the question hung in the air like smoke, impossible to ignore even when I tried. I'm 21 years old, though most days I feel either 17 or 35, depending on how badly I've handled whatever situation I'm currently avoiding. I'm a literature major because I've always been better at understanding other people's stories than my own. There's something safe about analyzing fictional characters, picking apart their motivations and desires from the comfortable distance of academic theory. Real life doesn't offer that same luxury of interpretation. I spend most of my time in places where I can observe without being observed. Coffee shops with tables tucked into corners where I can read and write and watch the world happen around me. The library stacks on the 3rd floor, where hardly anyone ventures unless they're desperately searching for some obscure text for a senior thesis. And yes, the Student Union Pool Hall, though that particular sanctuary has been compromised ever since Damian made it impossible for me to think about anything else when I'm there. The Student Union building itself is this architectural nightmare from the 70s. All brown brick and small windows that make every room feel like it's underground even when it's not. The pool hall is in the basement level, which only adds to that sense of being removed from the regular world. There are 6 tables total, though 2 of them have felt so worn you might as well be playing on cardboard. The jukebox is older than both Damian and me combined, loaded with songs that were popular when our parents were in college. Most of the time it's broken, which is probably for the best. This is where I've been coming almost every evening for the past 8 months, ever since I discovered that the noise level was just right for thinking, not quiet enough to make you feel alone with your thoughts, but not so loud that you couldn't hear yourself think. It became my routine, my way of transitioning from the academic demands of the day into whatever passed for my personal life. Damian changed all of that, of course. He has this way of filling up whatever space he's in, not through loudness or aggression, but through this natural magnetism that makes people want to be around him. He's a kinesiology major, which means he studies human movement, how bodies work, how they respond to different stimuli. There's something fitting about that, given how acutely aware I've become of my own body whenever he's near. He's different from me in almost every way that matters. Where I'm careful and analytical, he's intuitive and spontaneous. Where I dress in neutral colors that won't draw attention, he wears these worn leather jackets and vintage band t-shirts that somehow look effortlessly cool instead of like he's trying too hard. His hair is always slightly messy in a way that suggests he either spends no time on it at all or exactly the right amount of time, making it look like he doesn't care. When we first met, I was convinced he was one of those people who coast through college on charm and natural ability, who never have to work hard because everything comes easily to them. It took me weeks to realize how wrong I was. Damian is smart, genuinely smart, in ways that don't always show up in traditional academic settings. He understands people intuitively, can read a room in seconds, and adjust his approach accordingly. He remembers details about conversations we had weeks ago, brings up books I mentioned in passing, notices when I'm having a bad day before I've even admitted it to myself. Our friendship developed gradually, the way most meaningful relationships do when you're not paying attention. What started as polite collaboration on that psychology project evolved into casual conversations before and after class. Those conversations led to coffee, then to study sessions that were more talking than studying, then to these evening games of pool that became the highlight of my week in ways I wasn't ready to examine too closely. I told myself it was just friendship, even when the evidence suggested otherwise. When Damian started showing up places he knew I'd be, when he'd remember my coffee order without being asked, when he'd find excuses to touch my arm or shoulder during our conversations, I explained it all away as the behavior of someone who is naturally affectionate, someone comfortable with casual physical contact in ways I've never been. But friendship doesn't explain the way my pulse quickens when I see him across campus, or the way I started planning my evenings around our pool games, or the way I found myself paying attention to details I had no business noticing, like how his laugh changes depending on whether he's genuinely amused or just being polite, like how he bites his lip when he's concentrating on a difficult shot, like how his eyes look almost green under the pool hall's fluorescent lights. 3 weeks ago, when he whispered those words that changed everything between us, I realized I'd been lying to myself about what had been all along. The game had never really been about pool. 3 weeks of careful avoidance came to an end on a Friday night that felt different from the moment I woke up that morning. The campus had that restless energy that comes before a big away football game, when half the student body disappears for the weekend and the other half acts like they've been released from some unspoken obligation to maintain normal social patterns. I almost didn't go to the union that night. I've been finding excuses to avoid our usual pool games ever since that moment when everything shifted between us. Study group meetings that ran late, shifts at the campus bookstore that I volunteered to pick up, anything that would let me maintain the illusion that I was too busy to notice how empty my evenings felt without our familiar routine. But by 7 o'clock, I'd run out of legitimate ways to occupy my time. My homework was caught up, my laundry was done, and the novel I'd been trying to read kept failing to hold my attention. Every few minutes, I'd find myself checking the time, calculating whether Damian might already be downstairs, whether enough people would be around to make the atmosphere feel safely public. The student union felt different that night, hollowed out in a way that made every sound echo more than usual. The television in the main lounge was showing the pre-game coverage to maybe 6 people scattered across chairs that usually held 20. The food court had closed early, leaving only the vending machines humming in the corner. Even the pool hall, when I finally made my way downstairs, held maybe half its usual Friday night crowd. I'd been there for about 20 minutes, practicing solo shots on the table farthest from the entrance, when I heard his voice behind me. "Hey, stranger," he said, and something in my chest loosened and tightened simultaneously at the familiar sound of it. I turned around to find Damian pulling off his jacket, his hair damp from what must have been a brief shower of rain outside. He looked tired in a way that made me want to ask if he was okay. But there was something else in his expression, something that reminded me uncomfortably of that night 3 weeks ago when he'd stood too close and asked me questions I couldn't answer. He dropped a handful of quarters on the edge of the table with that characteristic grin that never quite reached his eyes when he was really paying attention to something. "Best of 3? He asked, like we hadn't spent the last 3 weeks carefully avoiding being alone together, like nothing had changed at all. I should have said no. I should have made some excuse about needing to leave soon, should have maintained the safe distance I've been working so hard to establish. Instead, I heard myself agreeing, watched myself rack the balls like this was just another ordinary evening instead of the moment I'd been both dreading and anticipating for weeks. The first game felt almost normal. We fell back into our usual pattern of competitive banter and good-natured trash talk, the kind of easy interaction that had defined our friendship before everything became complicated. Damian made jokes about my form. I pointed out his tendency to overthink difficult shots, and for a while I could almost convince myself that we'd successfully returned to whatever we'd been before. But there were differences, subtle shifts in the rhythm that I couldn't ignore no matter how hard I tried. The way Damian's eyes would linger on me a beat too long when I was setting up a shot. The way he'd move around the table, always managing to position himself where I'd have to brush past him or ask him to move. The way certain comments hung in the air, just slightly longer than they should have, as if we were both waiting for someone to acknowledge the subtext that neither of us was willing to name. I won the first game by a narrow margin, sinking the 8-ball with a shot that was equal parts skill and luck. Damian congratulated me with a handshake that lasted exactly 1 second longer than it should have, his thumb brushing across my knuckles in a way that could have been accidental, but definitely wasn't. The second game was closer, more intense. We were both playing better than usual, as if the stakes had been raised without either of us explicitly acknowledging it. I found myself hyper-aware of everything. The sound of balls clicking together, the way the light fell across the felt, the particular way Damian moved when he was concentrating on a difficult angle. Damian won that game with a combination shot that was genuinely impressive, the kind of play that would have earned applause if we'd had an audience. As it was, there were maybe 4 other people in the entire pool hall, all absorbed in their own games and conversations. That left us tied going into the final game, and something about that felt significant in a way I couldn't quite articulate. The air between us had changed again, taking on that charged quality I remembered from 3 weeks ago. Every shot felt deliberate, every movement around the table like part of some elaborate dance we were both learning as we went. I was ahead by 2 balls when Damian leaned over the table to line up what should have been a routine shot. Instead of taking it immediately, he paused, glancing up at me with that expression I was beginning to recognize as dangerous. "You know," he said, his voice casual in a way that didn't match the intensity in his eyes, "I've been thinking about what you said that night. About wanting to take things slow." "I never said that," I replied, though my voice came out rougher than I'd intended. Damian smiled, the kind of smile that acknowledged he'd caught me in something I wasn't ready to admit. "No," he said, "you didn't say anything at all. That's what I've been thinking about." His observation hung between us like a challenge I wasn't sure I knew how to meet. I stood there gripping my cue, watching him take a shot with the kind of deliberate precision that told me he was thinking about more than just pool. The ball dropped cleanly into the side pocket, and when he straightened up, there was something different in his posture, a kind of certainty that made my pulse quicken. I managed to sink my next shot, then the one after that, maintaining focus through sheer force of will while my mind raced through every possible interpretation of what was happening between us. The pool hall felt smaller somehow, the distance between us compressed until I was acutely aware of every movement he made, every breath, every glance. When I finally missed, leaving him an easy run to victory, part of me wondered if I'd done it on purpose. The thought was unsettling enough that I pushed it aside, but not before noticing the way Damian looked at me as he chalked his cue for the final shots. Like he knew exactly what I was thinking. He cleared the table methodically, each shot flowing into the next with the kind of casual skill that only comes from hours of practice. When the 8-ball disappeared into the corner pocket with a satisfying thunk, he set his cue against the wall and turned to face me with that lazy confidence I'd come to recognize as his most dangerous expression. "Guess I'm yours, then," he said, the words carrying the weight of that night 3 weeks ago when he'd first challenged me to acknowledge what was building between us. He stepped closer, not quite into my personal space, but close enough that I had to look up to meet his eyes. His voice was quieter when he continued. "So what do you want to do with me?" The same question he'd asked before, the one I'd spent 3 weeks avoiding. But this time, something in me shifted. Maybe it was the way he was looking at me, patient but unwavering. Maybe it was the emptiness of the pool hall around us, the sense that we were suspended in a moment removed from the normal rules of our carefully maintained friendship. Or maybe I was just tired of pretending I didn't know what I wanted. "I want to get out of here," I said, the words emerging before I could second-guess them into silence. Damian's smile was subtle but unmistakable. "Okay," he said. "Where to?" I hadn't thought that far ahead, but the answer came easier than it should have. "Your place." He nodded like he'd been expecting that response, like we'd been having a different conversation entirely and had finally reached its illogical conclusion. He grabbed his jacket from the back of a nearby chair, and I found myself following him toward the exit without consciously deciding to do so. The walk to his apartment complex took us through the older part of campus, where the streetlights were spaced farther apart, and the buildings looked like they remembered when the university was half its current size. The night air was cooler than it had been earlier, carrying the promise of rain that might or might not actually materialize. We walked in relative silence, our footsteps creating a rhythm that felt more intimate than conversation would have. Damian lived in one of those converted houses that had been chopped up into studio apartments for students who couldn't afford the newer complexes closer to campus. His was on the second floor, up a narrow staircase that creaked under our combined weight. The hallway smelled like someone was cooking curry and someone else was burning incense, the kind of olfactory collision that was distinctly college housing. He fumbled with his keys for a moment longer than necessary, and I realized he might be nervous too. The thought was oddly comforting, a reminder that whatever was happening between us was uncharted territory for both of us. The door opened to reveal a space that was smaller than I'd expected, but somehow felt larger than it should have. There was a futon that doubled as both bed and couch, a desk cluttered with textbooks and notebooks, a small kitchen area that was clean in the way that suggested he'd actually been expecting company. The walls were covered with posters that managed to avoid the typical college cliches, art prints, and concert advertisements that showed actual thought behind their selection. He gestured toward the futon. "Make yourself comfortable," he said. "You want something to drink? I've got beer, or I can make coffee if you prefer." "Beer's fine," I said, settling onto the edge of the futon and trying to process the strangeness of being in this space that was entirely his. I'd imagined it before, of course, during those long evenings when I'd wondered what it would be like to see the private version of Damian, the one that existed outside our public interactions. He handed me a bottle that was pleasantly cold and settled beside me, close enough that our knees were almost touching. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The silence felt different from our usual comfortable quiet, charged with the awareness that we'd crossed some invisible line by being here together. "So," he said finally, taking a sip of his beer and looking at me with that directness that had always made me slightly uncomfortable. "Here we are." "Here we are," I agreed, though I wasn't entirely sure what here meant or what we were supposed to do now that we'd arrived. Damian set his beer on the small table beside the futon and turned to face me more fully. "I've been thinking about this for a while," he said. "About you. About us." The honesty in his voice made something in my chest tighten. "How long is a while?" "Months," he said without hesitation. "Maybe since that first day we got paired up for that psychology project, and you spent 10 minutes explaining why behaviorism was reductive before you even asked my name." His admission settled between us like something tangible, something I could almost reach out and touch. I took a longer sip of my beer than necessary, buying myself time to process what he'd just told me. Months. He'd been thinking about this for months, which meant all those moments I'd convinced myself I was imagining. The lingering looks, the casual touches, the way conversations would pause just a beat too long, had been real after all. "You remember that?" I asked because focusing on the specific memory felt safer than addressing the larger implication of what he'd said. "Of course I remember that," Damian said, and there was something almost fond in his voice. "You were so passionate about it, so convinced that reducing human behavior to simple stimulus and response was missing the point entirely. You had this way of talking with your hands when you got excited about an idea, like you were trying to pull the right words out of the air." I felt heat rise in my cheeks. I'd always been self-conscious about that particular habit, the way my hands seemed to have a mind of their own when I was trying to explain something I cared about. The fact that he'd noticed, that he'd found it memorable rather than annoying, shifted something in how I understood those early interactions between us. "I thought you were going to be one of those partners who shows up unprepared and expects everyone else to carry the weight," I said. "You had this way of looking completely relaxed, even when Dr. Morrison was explaining the most complicated concepts." Damian laughed, a sound that was warmer in the intimate space of his apartment than it had ever been in the echoing pool hall. "I was terrified," he said. I'm good at reading people, at figuring out what they expect from me, but you were different. You actually cared about the ideas, not just about getting through the assignment. I spent half that first meeting trying to figure out how to impress you. The conversation was taking on a quality I hadn't expected, this gentle excavation of moments I'd thought belonged only to my own memory. We talked about those early weeks, the way our study sessions had gradually become less about psychology and more about everything else. How he'd started showing up at the coffee shop where I usually worked on essays, claiming it was just coincidence even though it was nowhere near his usual route across campus. How I'd begun timing my arrivals at the pool hall to coincide with when I thought he might appear, then pretending surprise when he walked through the door. It was nearly midnight when the conversation finally shifted toward what was happening right now, in this moment, instead of what had been building over all those months. We'd moved closer together on the futon without consciously deciding to, our knees touching now, his arm draped across the back in a way that wasn't quite around my shoulders but suggested it could be. "Can I tell you something?" he said, his voice quieter than it had been all evening. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. "I used to let you in sometimes. At pool. Not always, and not obviously, but sometimes when I could see you were having a rough day, or when you seemed like you needed something to go right, I'd miss a shot I should have made." The admission hit me with unexpected force. All those evenings when I'd felt genuinely accomplished, when I'd walked away from the table with the satisfaction of having earned a victory, and some of them had been gifts I hadn't even known I was receiving. "Why?" I asked. "Because I like seeing you smile," he said simply. "Because you got this look when you sank the winning shot, like you'd surprise yourself with your own capability. Because I was already falling for you, and I wasn't ready to admit it, so I did small things instead." The words hung in the air between us, and I realized we'd reached the moment I'd been both wanting and dreading since that night 3 weeks ago. This was where pretense stopped working, where the careful distance I'd maintained became impossible to sustain. I wasn't joking that night, he continued, his eyes steady on mine. "When I said winter gets me, I wasn't joking about any of it." "I know," I said, and saying it felt like stepping off a cliff. "I think I knew then, too. That's why I couldn't answer your question." "What question?" he asked, though his slight smile suggested he knew exactly which one. "What I wanted to do with you. And now?" The question was barely above a whisper. I set my beer on the table next to his and turned to face him fully. The movement brought us even closer, close enough that I could see the flecks of gold in his brown eyes, close enough to notice the way his breathing had changed. "Now I think I'm ready to find out," I said. The kiss, when it finally happened, was nothing like I'd imagined during all those months of not admitting I was imagining it. It was slower, more tentative, as if we were both aware of how long we'd been building toward this moment and didn't want to rush past it too quickly. His hand found the back of my neck, fingers threading through my hair, and I felt something in me relax that I hadn't even realized was tense. When we broke apart, he rested his forehead against mine, both of us breathing a little harder than the kiss itself warranted. "I wasn't joking tonight, either," he said quietly. "About what?" "About being yours, if you want me." The simplicity of it, the directness, was so completely Damian that I almost laughed. Instead, I kissed him again, deeper this time, and let that be my answer. The kiss changed the air in the room, made everything that came after feel both inevitable and impossibly fragile. We stayed close for a moment longer, foreheads touching, breathing each other's space, before the weight of what had just happened began to settle over us like something we needed to examine in the light. Damian was the first to pull back, though not far. His hand remained on the back of my neck, thumb tracing small circles that sent shivers down my spine in ways I was still learning to process. His eyes searched my face with an intensity that made me feel transparent, like he was trying to read every thought I wasn't saying out loud. "You okay?" he asked, and the question carried more weight than its simple words suggested. He was asking if I was going to run, if this was the moment I'd retreat back into the safety of friendship and careful distance. I nodded, though I wasn't entirely sure what okay meant in this context. My heart was doing something erratic in my chest, and my thoughts felt scattered in ways that made it difficult to focus on anything beyond the warmth of his hand and the way the lamplight caught the gold flecks in his eyes. We should probably talk about this, I said, because that felt like what responsible adults were supposed to do when they crossed lines they'd been carefully avoiding for months. Probably, he agreed, but he didn't move away. If anything, he shifted slightly closer, his knee pressing more firmly against mine. What do you want to talk about? The question was simple enough, but it opened up territories I wasn't sure I knew how to navigate. What do we talk about? The fact that everything between us had just shifted in ways that couldn't be undone? The months of careful friendship that had been building toward exactly this moment? The reality that we'd have to see each other in class twice a week regardless of how this played out. I don't know, I admitted. I've never done this before. This? He asked, and there was something gentle in his voice that made it easier to be honest. Any of this? I gestured vaguely between us, encompassing the kiss, the conversation, the entire situation we'd created. I don't know what comes next. Damian was quiet for a moment, considering. Neither do I, he said finally. But I know what I don't want. What's that? I don't want to pretend this didn't happen. I don't want to go back to the way things were before, where we're both carefully not acknowledging what's right there between us. The honesty in his voice made something in my chest tighten. I'd been preparing myself for the possibility that this was just a moment, something we'd explore briefly before retreating to safer ground. The idea that he wanted something more, something that couldn't be easily categorized or dismissed, was both thrilling and terrifying. What do you want then? I asked. He smiled at that, an expression that was softer than his usual confident grin. I want to see where this goes, he said. I want to stop pretending that I don't think about you more than I should. I want to find out what it's like to kiss you when we're not both surprised that it's happening. The last part made me laugh despite the seriousness of the conversation. Were you surprised? A little, he said. I've been wanting to do that for months, but I wasn't sure you'd want me to. You're not exactly easy to read sometimes. I considered that observation, recognizing the truth in it. I'd spent so much energy over the past months trying to hide what I was feeling that I'd probably given him mixed signals at best. The careful distance I'd maintained, the way I deflected every moment that got too intense, the 3 weeks of avoidance after he'd first challenged me to acknowledge what was happening between us. I'm not good at this, I said, at being open about what I want, at taking risks with people I care about. I know, he said simply. That's part of what I like about you. You don't do anything halfway. When you decide to trust someone, it means something. The clock on his desk read past 1 in the morning, and I realized we'd been talking for hours. The conversation had meandered through territory I'd never expected to cover, revealed things about both of us that felt important in ways I couldn't fully articulate. But underneath it all was this growing awareness that we'd reached a decision point, a moment where we had to choose what this was going to be. I could leave, I realized. I could thank him for the evening, make some excuse about having things to do in the morning, and walk back to my own apartment. We could return to our careful friendship, maybe with a new layer of awkwardness that would eventually fade into something manageable. It would be the safe choice, the one that didn't risk complicating the good thing we already had. But sitting there in the warm light of his living room, with his hands still resting on the back of my neck and his eyes steady on mine, the safe choice felt like the wrong one. Not just wrong, but impossible. Like trying to forget something that had already become part of how I understood myself. I don't want to go home tonight, I said, the words emerging quieter than I'd intended, but carrying more certainty than I'd felt about anything in months. Something in Damian's expression shifted, became more serious. You sure? I nodded, then realized that wasn't enough. Yes, I said. I'm sure. He studied my face for another moment, as if double-checking that I meant what I was saying. Then he smiled, that slow smile that had been undoing my carefully maintained composure for months. Good, he said, because I wasn't ready to let you leave anyway. He stood up, extending his hand to me in a gesture that felt both casual and momentous. I took it, letting him pull me up from the futon, and followed him toward the part of the apartment that served as his bedroom. As we moved through the space, I kicked off my shoes, a small gesture that felt like a larger commitment, a way of saying that I was staying, that I was ready to see what came next. Morning arrived gradually, filtering through the thin curtains in shifts of gray and gold that painted soft geometry across the walls of Damian's apartment. I woke slowly, consciousness returning in layers, awareness spreading from the warmth pressed against my side to the unfamiliar ceiling above me to the quiet sounds of the city, beginning another day beyond the windows. Damian was still asleep, his breathing deep and even against my shoulder. Sometime during the night, we'd arranged ourselves into this configuration, him curled slightly toward me, my arm beneath his head serving as a pillow. The position should have been uncomfortable after hours in the same spot, but instead it felt like the most natural thing in the world, like we'd been sleeping this way for years instead of for the first time. I stayed still, not wanting to wake him, and let myself process what had happened. Not just the night before, but all of it. The months of careful friendship, the gradual awareness that what I felt for him had grown beyond anything I could safely categorize, the evening when everything finally shifted into honesty. The conversation that had lasted until nearly 3 in the morning, meandering through territories of admission and possibility that I'd never explored with anyone before. We hadn't done anything more than kiss and talk and eventually fall asleep together on his narrow bed. But somehow, that felt like enough. More than enough. It felt like everything had changed in the most fundamental way possible. Not through any single dramatic gesture, but through the simple act of finally acknowledging what had been true for months. The light continued to strengthen, and with it came the sounds of weekend morning life. Someone in the apartment below was making coffee, the familiar gurgle of an old machine working its way through a cycle. A car door slammed in the parking lot, followed by footsteps on gravel. Somewhere in the distance, a dog was barking with a persistent enthusiasm that suggested its owner was taking too long to get ready for their morning walk. All of it felt distant, muffled by the windows and walls, but also by the sense that this space we'd created together existed slightly apart from the regular world. Like we'd found some pocket of time that belonged entirely to us, where the usual rules and expectations couldn't quite reach. Damian stirred against my shoulder, a small movement that gradually expanded into the slow stretch of someone emerging from deep sleep. His eyes opened to find me already watching him, and for a moment we just looked at each other in the growing light, both of us probably processing the strangeness and rightness of waking up this way. "Hi," he said, his voice rough with sleep and tinged with something that might have been uncertainty. Like he was checking to make sure I hadn't changed my mind in the interim between sleeping and waking. "Hi," I replied, and smiled because his hair was doing something impossible on one side, and because he looked younger somehow in the morning light, less certain of himself than he usually did. "How did you sleep?" he asked, a question that carried the weight of all the other questions he wasn't asking. Was I okay with this? Did I regret staying? Was I going to retreat back in a safe distance now that daylight had returned? "Better than I have in weeks," I said, which was true in ways I hadn't expected. Despite the unfamiliar bed and the newness of everything between us, I'd slept more deeply than I had since that night 3 weeks ago, when he'd first challenged me to acknowledge what I wanted. "Good," he said, and the relief in his voice was subtle but unmistakable. "I was worried you might wake up and panic." I considered that possibility, recognizing that it would have been entirely consistent with my usual pattern of approaching emotional complexity. The impulse was there, the familiar urge to overthink and retreat, but it felt manageable now, overshadowed by the simple contentment of being exactly where I was. "I might still panic later," I said, "but right now I'm okay." Damian laughed, a sound that was warm and unguarded in the quiet of the morning. "Right now is all we need to worry about," he said. He was right, of course. There would be time later to figure out what this meant for our friendship, for the classes we shared, for all the practical considerations that came with shifting the fundamental nature of a relationship. There would be conversations to have and decisions to make, and probably moments of awkwardness as we learned how to be whatever we were becoming. But none of that felt urgent in the soft light of Saturday morning, with his warmth solid against my side and no obligations pulling us back into the regular rhythms of our separate lives. For now, it was enough to exist in this space we'd created, this pocket of possibility that belonged entirely to us. I adjusted the blanket over both of us and settled back against the pillow, letting myself relax into the unfamiliar luxury of having nowhere else I needed to be. Damian shifted slightly, finding a more comfortable position that somehow brought us even closer together. The game had never really been about pool, I thought, remembering that night weeks ago when he'd first whispered those words that changed everything between us. It had been about finding our way to each other through all the careful distance and unspoken attraction, about discovering what it felt like to stop pretending we didn't want exactly what we'd found. Outside, the city continued its weekend morning routine, but inside this small apartment, time felt suspended, elastic, entirely our own. I closed my eyes and let myself drift in the space between sleeping and waking, content to exist in this moment that felt like both an ending and a beginning, like everything I'd been unconsciously moving toward for months without knowing it.